Thank you for joining the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Northwestern Division for today's Missouri River Basin Water Management Conference. Due to higher than average reservoir levels and releases, the next call will be held Tuesday, August 7th at 1 p.m. Central. If basin conditions warrant an ad hoc call due to an unexpected change, we will notify the region of the additional call. These calls are provided as a courtesy to congressional representatives, tribal, state, and local government officials, and the media. I am Eileen Williamson, and I will be moderating today's call. The slides from today's call are on our website at www.nwd-mr.usace.army.mil/rcc/. They are also linked in today's press release. These calls are recorded and placed on the Defense Video and Imagery Distribution System at www.dvidS-hub.net/unit/USACE-NWD. Your participation in this call acknowledges your consent to be recorded. All lines have been placed on mute. To unmute your line to ask a question, press *6. Please be aware that the forced mute function does not work on all phones. So if I ask, please use your phone's own mute function to avoid interrupting the call. Do not place the call on hold. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the call. Calls for questions will not be part of the recording if none are asked. For the convenience of our media representatives, the final slide in this presentation includes each speaker's name, title, and contact information. The agenda and presenters' names for today's call will be as follows: Doug Cluck from NOAA's National Center for Environmental Information, Kevin Lau from the National Weather Service's Missouri River Basin Forecast Center, and John Remus, Chief of Missouri River Basin Water Management Division with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, along with others from his staff, who will provide an update on current reservoir operations and the runoff forecast and on support to the other authorized purposes. We'll move on to slide 2, and Doug Cluck will provide an update.
All right. How about slide 3? There we go. All right. Thanks. Thank you to the Corps and everyone else on the call today for joining us today. I'm going to give you a brief on the current situation in terms of the climate as it was or has been over the last few months, as well as an outlook over the next 3 months, more or less. So the conditions over the last 30 days, you can see on the temperature that the departure from normal temperatures on the left hand. There you see the sort of warmer colors, the oranges and yellows and even a little bit of red, indicate that temperatures have been pretty warm compared to normal over the last 30 days, especially in the lower part of the basin, and I'd say eastern portions of the basin, and slightly below normal as you move into Montana, northern Wyoming. And then the other image on this slide shows precipitation or percent of normal precipitation pretty much for the month of June. Obviously, you see the 5th of June through the 4th of July. Anytime you see green to purple colors, that's above normal precipitation. And again, much of Montana, much of Wyoming, western South Dakota, southeastern South Dakota, Nebraska, even down into portions of Kansas have seen, and western Iowa have seen much above normal precipitation over this period. But you also see some yellows and oranges and reds, which indicate, in some cases, less than half their normal precipitation during this normally wet month, that is June, especially in the southern part of the basin and portions and sort of dotted here and there across other portions of the Missouri Basin. But by and large, the conditions have been relatively wet and relatively warm, except for portions of Montana, which we said earlier over the last 30 days. The next slide. Looking back over the last 3 months, things kind of evened themselves out a little bit in terms of temperature. The left-hand image up there. Again, the yellow. When you see yellow and a light green, that's pretty close to near normal, but the oranges are above, sort of orange tan colors are above normal. So the lower basin, again, has been relatively warm. In the upper basin, we'll just say near normal in terms of temperatures over the last 90 days, since the beginning, more or less, of April. Turning our attention to precipitation on the lower right corner, you see some substantial areas of much above normal precipitation. And really, this is the rainy season for much of the basin, especially at the lower elevations. And we expect to see the highest normal rainfall. Well, where you see purples and greens and blues again, those are above normal, and in some cases substantially above normal, especially up in Montana, portions of Wyoming, and southeast South Dakota for that matter. So there have been issues with that, especially also in western Nebraska, where you see the purples out there, quite a bit of water precipitation. On the flip side, you can see where it's awfully dry in Colorado over the last 90 days, and sort of a persisting pattern, if you will. I know I live here in Kansas City, and this is what we see, is a lot of dryness. And so we have less than, in some places across northern Missouri, places with less than half of our normal precipitation for this time of year, for this last 90 days. And that's also the case, if you will, for portions of eastern South Dakota. Maybe not so drastic as in Missouri and in far northern Montana as well. Next slide. This is an outlook, more or less, for the next 7 days. When you accumulate all the precipitation you can over the next 7 days, according to the models, the computer models, this is the pattern that you get across the United States. Well, again, if you sort of generally know where the Missouri Basin is from St. Louis north and west into Montana, you see that most of the basin as a whole, starting in Montana and sort of edging your way down there through the Dakotas and certainly down into Missouri, look pretty dry. And all that green there is really very, very indication of the probability of very light precipitation for the most part. I'm sure hit and miss thunderstorm can make a little bit more than that, but generally they're calling for this shows me that this is relatively dry. Now you do see abundance of moisture or sort of sneaking into Colorado, not so much in the Missouri Basin, but that's what we call the summer monsoon precipitation coming up from the southwest, and maybe a little bit more across the Dakotas in terms of precipitation. But generally for the next 7 days, a fairly dry pattern for the Missouri Basin. Next slide. So looking out, instead of looking at accumulated amounts, which was the last one, this is where probabilities of temperature and precipitation above or below or near normal for week 2. In other words, July 13th through the 19th. So not the next 7 days, but the 7 days after that, if you will. This is looking ahead at what we call week 2. And again, temperature map is pretty easy to explain. It's above normal temperatures are much more likely to occur over the entire basin. That'll lead to more evaporation, and you can look at the precipitation map down to the lower right. That brownish, tannish color indicates better chances for below normal precipitation, probably where, in some cases, where it's been pretty wet, which is probably a good thing. Also, that sort of southwestern Four Corners area getting better chances up into Wyoming and Colorado, better chances for above normal precipitation in those areas. Generally, the general idea here is that warmer than normal conditions and drier than normal conditions for the most part over the Missouri Basin, week 2. Next slide. Looking at July as a whole, and we'll have to see how this one's going to turn out because it's not starting off this way so much. But July outlook is, again, the left-hand picture there is temperature probabilities, and the probabilities are leaning towards cooler than normal conditions across most of Montana. At least the probabilities are a little bit enhanced there for that. But for the lion's share of the basin, where you see the tans and oranges, the chances for above normal temperatures are increased. And then in terms of precipitation, lower right-hand corner image shows that, again, we call it monsoonal moisture coming up out of the southwest. You see some of that green, very weak chances of above normal precipitation extending up into Montana and Wyoming. But again, those probabilities are relatively low, even though they are leaning towards being above normal. And then a little bit of dryness sort of sneaking up, or a higher chance of dryness sneaking up into the southern plains, maybe into very southern parts of the basin. Next slide, please. Looking over July, August, and September, so the next 3 months, really, the outlook is for the most part, above normal, better chances for above normal temperatures across the basin, except for portions of North Dakota, or almost all of North Dakota, and portions of South Dakota and western Iowa for the most part. They have equal chances, so equal chance of being above, below, or near normal. And then in terms of precipitation, really not much to speak of here. A slight leaning towards above normal precipitation across Wyoming, Colorado, and then a teeny bit of better chances for below normal precipitation across the extreme western portions of Montana. Next slide. Here's the situation with the drought monitor. The national picture for the drought monitor shows that there is lingering drought across the Dakotas and Montana, and then sort of a more substantial drought as you get down towards the lower part of the basin. And if you hit the next button to go to the next slide, should show sort of a blown-up view of the Missouri Basin as a whole, just cut out. You can see the trouble spot really from a drought perspective is the lower basin, and really no major issues for the rest of the basin as a whole. Next slide. And then finally with drought, this is the update outlook for where drought could grow or could increase in certainly in geography. They're really talking the lower part of the basin in terms of more drought coverage, I guess is the best way to say that, and maybe even getting worse. And all the indicators that we've seen in the last few maps that we've looked at sort of point in this direction, to be honest with you. Upper basin, no major issues, no major improvements, no major degradation, I guess you could say, from a drought point of view. Next slide. Here are the key points, something I hadn't brought up yet, but just for your information, the El Nino, La Nina situation is such that the Climate Prediction Center has put us into an El Nino watch, which means conditions are favorable to move into or become a El Nino situation. In very short, that does tend to mean warmer and sometimes drier conditions for the upper basin. It doesn't mean much for the central and southern parts of the basin, but generally speaking, El Ninos tend to be a little drier and warmer, especially in the northern part of the basin, and especially in the cool season, basically December, January, February, that time frame. The upper basin has been relatively wet for the most part across most of it. The lower basin, pretty darn dry, and I would say the extreme lower basin, sort of Nebraska City South, if you will. Warmer than normal temperatures across the region except for portions of Montana and Wyoming. That's the situation as of now. The predictions for July temperatures likely continued hot, warm and or hot for the short term, next week or two. Montana has a better chance of being, for the month of July, Montana has a slightly better chance of being cooler or near normal than the rest of the basin. The 3-month outlook, July through September, likely warmer south and west, actually most of the basin south and west, and then small or equal chances for the northeastern part of the basin in terms of temperature. Precipitation into the summer, short term, relatively dry. July, mainly equal chances, leans a little bit wetter in the upper portion of the basin, drier, far southern parts of the basin. And then the 3-month outlook, as we just went over, equal chances with a little bit of elevated chance for above normal precipitation in Wyoming and Colorado because of the monsoon. And then below normal chances for slightly better than normal chances for below normal temperatures in western Montana. And then finally, as far as drought, some development, especially in the lower basin. And that concludes my talk, I'm pretty darn sure. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. And Kevin, you're up.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I too want to thank the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for inviting the National Weather Service to participate in this series of calls. It's been a very busy month since the 5th of June, and in the past 30 days there's been at least one location in every state in the basin except Colorado that has crested above flood stage. Major flooding has occurred in the following watersheds: the Muscle Shale, the Vermilion, the Floyd, the Rock, the Saline, and the Big and Little Sioux basins. And new provisional crest records have been set at 5 locations in the past 30 days. And today there remain several locations that are above flood stage, including Turtle Creek, which is a small trib to the James River in South Dakota, the Little Sioux River in Iowa, the Big Sioux River in Iowa and South Dakota, and the Rock River in Iowa, and the Missouri River itself in the Brownville to Miami reach. While specific locations that have recently experienced flooding are at an increased risk for continued flooding this summer, this increased risk remains below the 50 percentile for most locations. For example, our latest 90-day river outlook for the Floyd River in Iowa suggests a 20% chance for flooding to reoccur this summer, whereas historically there's only a 10% chance for flooding to occur during the next 90 days. So while the risk has indeed increased, the chance for actual flooding at any given location remains relatively low. As you move further south into the area of southern Iowa, eastern Kansas, and the state of Missouri, there's always a good chance to experience localized thunderstorm-driven flooding, and that remains our outlook for this year as well. So the bottom line from the River Forecast Center is that while we have been very active for the past 30 days, our latest long-range river outlooks do not indicate that this level of activity will necessarily continue into the future. Thank you, and this concludes the National Weather Service Flood Brief.
All right, thank you, Kevin, and I'll hand it over to John Rivas.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today for the July Missouri Basin Conference Call. We appreciate your participation. Flood control remains our primary consideration as we move through the summer months. It is important to understand that floods can and will occur regardless of basin conditions due to summer thunderstorms, particularly along the lower river, which cannot be mitigated by operation of the main stem projects. Also, real-time regulation of the reservoirs is done using the best available hydrologic and climatic information and is adjusted to respond to changing conditions on the ground. Each month, and more frequently if needed, we produce updated runoff and reservoir regulation forecasts. Earlier this week, we posted the July runoff and reservoir regulation forecast on our webpage, and earlier today, we put out a press release covering much of the same information we are going to cover on the call today. Now, two of the senior engineers on our staff will describe these forecasts in more detail. We'll start with Kevin Stamm, who will discuss the updated 2018 runoff forecast. He'll be followed by Joel Konopchinsky, who will discuss the planned regulation of the reservoir system based on the current runoff forecast. Kevin?
Okay, thank you, John. Slide 15. Thank you. The 2018 calendar year runoff forecast for the Upper Missouri Basin above Sioux City, Iowa, updated on July 1st, is 39.8 million acre-feet, which is 150% of average. The runoff forecast considers recent runoff trends, drought and soil moisture conditions, accumulated precipitation, mountain snowpack, and the NOAA Climate Prediction Center's, or CPC's, monthly and seasonal temperature and precipitation outlooks. June runoff was almost 2 times the average runoff above Sioux City. Runoff was above average due to the mountain snowpack runoff and above normal precipitation in June. June precipitation was more than 150% of normal in much of Montana, the western Dakotas, southeastern South Dakota, northeastern Nebraska, and western Iowa. As a result, June runoff was about 160% of average in the Fort Peck Reach, 190% of average in the Garrison Reach, and over 300% of average in the Sioux City Reach. Compared to the last 120 years of record, the Garrison June runoff volume ranked as the second highest June runoff volume. For the entire upper basin above Sioux City, the June summation ranked as the third highest in the last 120 years. As noted by Doug Cluck, heavy rainfall also occurred in the lower basin. Minor to moderate or minor to major flooding occurred on several tributaries in the lower basin, and several locations on the Missouri River reached minor to moderate flood stages. We are now on slide 16. With regard to the mountain snowpack, it peaked in about mid-April, and on July 2nd, the mountain snowpack had essentially melted. Moving on to slide 17, and looking at our runoff forecast for the rest of 2018, we are expecting runoff in July to be about 160% of average because we expect the tributaries to continue to flow at above normal levels for the majority of the month. For the Fort Peck and Garrison reaches, we are forecasting about 160% of average runoff in July. For the lower 4 reaches, which include Oahe, Fort Randall, Gavins Point, and Sioux City, we're forecasting above average runoff for July and August. As for the fall months, September through December, we're forecasting near average runoff throughout the entire upper basin. In summary, the annual runoff forecast is 39.8 million acre-feet, which is 157% of average. Joel Konopchinsky will now discuss the July reservoir system regulation studies.
Thank you, Kevin. Reservoir system storage is currently 68.4 million acre-feet, or 12.3 million acre-feet, into the 16.3 million acre-feet of available flood storage. Approximately 25% of the flood storage is still available to capture runoff. This graphic shows a comparison of the current system storage to the system storage in wrong one here. Go down one. Yeah, this graphic shows a comparison of the current system storage to the system storage in 2011. The system storage is expected to peak this year in mid-July near 68.6 million acre-feet, or 4.2 million acre-feet below the 2011 peak storage of 72.8 million acre-feet. Moving back to slide 19, and we'll get to that. Gavins Point releases averaged 37,000 cubic feet per second in June. Due to water currently being stored in the reservoirs and the higher than average runoff being forecast in the Missouri River Basin above Sioux City, Iowa, the service level increased 25,000 cubic feet per second above full service in late June to facilitate the evacuation of stored floodwaters. Currently, Gavins Point releases are 42,000 cubic feet per second and will be increased to 60,000 cubic feet per second and possibly higher as downstream tributary flows recede. The monthly studies for the basic simulation uses the runoff forecast that Kevin just discussed. Due to the amount of variability in the precipitation and other hydrologic factors that can occur over the next several months, we also develop an upper and lower runoff that are then used in the upper and lower basic simulations. These simulations provide a range of reservoir elevations and releases that may be expected under the different runoff scenarios. The discussion to follow will focus on the basic or most likely runoff forecast. Information on the runoff simulations is posted on our webpage. Turning to slide 21. Looking at the upper 3 reservoirs, Fort Peck is currently at elevation 2247.8 or 1.8 feet into the exclusive flood control zone, which extends from elevation 2246 to 2250. It is expected to peak near elevation 2247.9 within the next week. Releases are maintained at 18,000 cubic feet per second. The release is in excess of the maximum powerhouse capacity, so releases are required from both the powerhouse and spillway. Garrison Reservoir is currently at elevation 1853.2, or 3.2 feet into the exclusive flood control zone, which extends from elevation 1850 to 1854. It is expected to peak near this elevation within the next week. Daily releases are currently 60,000 cubic feet per second. The maximum power plant release is 41,000 cubic feet per second. Therefore, releases are being made from both the powerhouse and the regulating tunnels. Oahe Reservoir is currently at elevation 1615.3, 7.8 feet above the base of the flood control pool, which extends from elevation 1607.5 to 1620. Due to the higher releases from Garrison, the reservoir will rise steadily over the next few weeks. It is expected to peak near elevation 1617, 9.5 feet into the 12.5-foot flood pool. Daily average releases are expected to range from the mid-40s to the lower 50,000 cubic feet per second this summer. And due to the higher releases from the projects, there is currently no hydro generation peaking being done at Fort Peck and Garrison. Moving on to the next slide. The navigation service level is used to determine releases from Gavins Point Dam to support navigation and to help provide an 8 to 9 foot deep navigation channel downstream. Flows at the full service level are designed to provide a 9 foot deep navigation channel. The service level for the remainder of the navigation season and the navigation season length are based on the July 1 system storage. However, because of the higher than normal runoff forecast and system storage, flow support was increased in late June to a level 25,000 cubic feet per second above full service. Based on the current forecast, the highest service level will continue with Gavins Point releases expected to be around 60,000 cubic feet per second this summer and fall, depending on downstream conditions. And a 10-day extension to the 8-month navigation support season will be provided. Releases will be reduced in response to downstream flooding. However, the effectiveness of the reservoir system to reduce peak stages along the lower river diminishes as you move downstream due to the travel time. Forecasted energy generation at the main stem dams for 2018 under the basic simulation is 13.7 billion kilowatt hours. This compares to the long-term average of approximately 9.3 billion kilowatt hours. Turning to the next slide, this shows the Missouri River Basin weekly update, which is found on our website at the address shown on the top of the slide. This webpage gives a general overview of the current conditions in the Missouri River Basin and is updated weekly, usually on Tuesday morning. Thank you, and this concludes my talk.
Thank you, Kevin and Joel. So in summary, during this period of high runoff, the reservoir system is operating as designed. We expect, as Joel said, we expect the system storage to peak in mid-July, and we will release that stored flood water through the remainder of the year. The system service level is at 25,000 cubic feet per second to facilitate this evacuation. Releases from all of the dams are expected to be higher than normal through the remainder of the year. I'd also like to thank Doug Cluck and Kevin Lau for their support on this call. That concludes the Corps of Engineers' remarks. Thank you very much. It's back to you, Eileen.
Thanks, John. The next slide shows your speakers for today and their names. And then we will move to questions, which will be fielded by state in alphabetical order. If you have a question, remember you'll need to press *6 to come off mute. We'll start with the state of Iowa. If there are any questions from congressional delegation members, tribes, state officials, or local government, or members of the press. State of Kansas, same, *6 to come off mute. Missouri. State of Montana, any questions? Nebraska? Remember *6 to come off mute. State of North Dakota. South Dakota?
This is Gary.
Yes.
This is Gary Stockert with Bismarck Emergency Management. I just have a question. Maybe I'm not sure if you intended to cover this or don't want to. Upper basic. I was just kind of wondering about that as far as trying to think of what document date this was. July 1st, and it's discussing the upper basic. What's the odds of that scenario? Or isn't there a specific, in other words, is it equal chances, or are you looking at like a slim chance or a 10% chance of upper basic? I was just kind of curious.
We don't assign a probability to that. That's based on just kind of historic observations. The one we publish, the most likely would be the equal chances scenario.
Okay. So with the upper basic, just as an example, it talks about the releases, what they would be, and I don't see that impacting Bismarck, but just from my understanding, it shows 1854. Now, just so I understand this, if the dam would actually get to 1854, would the releases actually always equal whatever the inflow is as a minimum?
Not necessarily. We could surcharge the reservoir by using the spillway gates if we needed to. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if my question was very clear. So let's say if you did get to 1854, if you had, for example, just as a hypothetical, if you had 70,000 CFS coming in, does that mean you'd automatically have to have 70,000 coming out when we get to 1854? Or did I?
No.
Okay, that's.
No, we wouldn't. We wouldn't automatically have to have 70,000 coming out.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know. Thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you. Any other questions from the state of North Dakota? State of South Dakota, *6 to come off mute.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
This is Jody at Dakota Radio Group in Pierre.
Are there two people at the same time there? Sorry.
Hello?
No, I got you. Okay, go ahead, Jody.
Okay, if I could get one of you to just kind of summarize the overall, in general, where things are at across the entire system right now. I don't know if that's going to be terribly easy to do, but just kind of hoping for an overall view right now, and then, what the next couple weeks are looking like.
Well, overall, I think we're in fairly good shape. As Joel said, we have about 25% of the system, of this flood control storage system-wide available. Fort Peck and Garrison are both in their exclusive flood control zones, so we're trying to evacuate that water as quickly as we can within the constraints that we have for flooding. We're beginning to ramp up our system releases out of Gavin's Point to begin to evacuate some of this water out of the system. Our plan is to bring Gavin's Point up, as Joel said, to near 60,000 cubic feet per second as quickly as we can without adding to the peaks downstream. We're looking to peak system storage-wise at about 68.6 million acre feet sometime around the middle of the month. While we have a full system, it's still in pretty good shape. As I mentioned in my summary, the system is working pretty much as designed for this particular runoff season. We do have a lot of runoff. 40 million acre feet is probably a top 5 or so runoff over 120 years of record. So this is a large year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else from the state of South Dakota?
Yes, hi. Jeremy Ludeman with South Dakota Public Broadcasting. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
So I would like just a review of the peaks at Oahe, Fort Randall, and then at Gavin's Point and Big Bend, if you have that information.
The peak what? Pools or discharges?
The peak, just the peak for the where it will be on the flood control for, I heard Oahe, I believe, but I didn't get Fort Randall or Big Bend or Gavin's Point. What does it look like in terms of the zone?
The pool elevations, Big Bend and Gavin's Point don't fluctuate that much. They're basically re-regulation reservoirs, so they won't fluctuate that much. Fort Randall is estimated to peak around 1362 elevation.
All right. And then taking a look at your the forecast for the releases from Big Bend, what does that look like in comparison to Oahe and Gavin's Point?
Well, the releases from Big Bend would pretty much mirror Oahe's, as it's a re-regulation dam. What comes in kind of goes out, so they would be very similar. And as we increase releases out of Gavin's Point, we'll increase releases out of Oahe, Big Bend, and Fort Randall to get that water down to Gavin's Point. They would be comparable, not necessarily exactly the same, but similar.
All right. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you. Anyone else from the state of South Dakota? All right, moving to Wyoming. Again, *6 to come off mute. All right, and any other members of the press or final questions before we adjourn? All right, thank you for your participation today. The next call is scheduled for 1 o'clock on Tuesday, August 7th, and we appreciate your participation.